My son bought his wife an expensive car on credit, then brought me the contract. Dad, you're going to pay for this. You owe us. I refused. They took me to court, demanding money for support. But the judge asked them just one question, and right after that, they dropped the case themselves. The morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Whitmore's kitchen table as he stared at the legal document that had arrived with yesterday's mail. The papers felt heavier than they should have, weighted with betrayal and disbelief. At 73, Harold had weathered many storms in his life. The loss of his beloved wife Margaret 3 years prior, the struggles of raising his son Damien as a single father after that, and the quiet loneliness that had settled into his bones like winter frost. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, when the child he had sacrificed everything for would turn against him with such calculated cruelty. The contract bore his son's signature alongside that of his daughter-in-law, Celestine, a woman whose name had once rolled off Harold's tongue like honey, but now tasted bitter as medicine. A luxury sedan, pristine and gleaming in the attached photographs, stared back at him from the documentation. The price tag made his pension seem like pocket change, and the monthly payments would drain his modest savings within a year. Yet there it was, in black and white. His name listed as the primary guarantor, his signature allegedly blessing this financial catastrophe. Harold's weathered hands trembled slightly as he traced the forged curves of what was supposed to be his handwriting. 47 years he had worked at the steel mill, his back growing crooked under the weight of honest labor, his lungs filling with dust and determination in equal measure. Every paycheck had been stretched like taffy, covering mortgage payments, school clothes, and the 1,000 small expenses that came with raising a child alone. He had denied himself new shoes so Damien could have the latest sneakers, had eaten beans and rice for dinner so his son could enjoy steak on his birthday. The irony wasn't lost on him that Damien had grown up to become everything Harold had hoped to shield him from: entitled, demanding, and blind to the value of hard-earned money. Marriage to Celestine had only amplified these traits, turning his son into a stranger who spoke in terms of what he was owed rather than what he was grateful for. Their visits had become increasingly rare, punctuated by requests for money that felt more like demands, their conversations hollow echoes of the warm relationship they had once shared. Harold remembered the day Damien had announced his engagement to Celestine, how the young woman's eyes had sparkled not with love, but with calculation as she surveyed his modest home. She had made comments about his potential and spoken in whispers to Damien about property values and inheritance planning. Even then, Harold had felt a chill run down his spine, recognizing the predatory gleam he had seen in the eyes of loan sharks and con artists during his younger days in the city. The phone call that had preceded this document still echoed in Harold's memory like a bad dream. Damien's voice had been cold, clinical, stripped of any filial warmth as he explained that Harold would be contributing to their new car purchase. Not asked, told. As if his signature on the guarantee was already a foregone conclusion, as if his decades of sacrifice had purchased not gratitude, but ownership of his remaining years. "You owe us, Dad," Damien had said, the words cutting through Harold's heart like a rusty blade. "After everything we've done for you, after all the times we've visited, after putting up with your complaints about being lonely, this is the least you can do. Besides, what else are you going to spend your money on?" The casual cruelty of that last question had left Harold speechless. What else was he going to spend his money on? Perhaps the medications that kept his heart beating steadily, or the heating bills that kept his old bones warm during harsh winters. Maybe the occasional dinner out that broke the monotony of solitary meals. or the small gifts he still bought for his neighbor's grandchildren because he missed having little ones around to spoil. Harold had refused, of course. His voice had been steady despite the earthquake of emotion threatening to topple his composure. He had explained about his fixed income, about the rising costs of living, about the uncertain future that awaited a man of his age. Damien had listened in silence before hanging up without a goodbye, leaving Harold staring at a dead phone and wondering where he had gone wrong as a father. Now, weeks later, the forged documents had arrived like a declaration of war. Harold's name had been signed with practiced precision, the handwriting close enough to pass casual inspection, but wrong in ways that only he would notice. The pressure points were different, the loop of his H too perfect, the slant of his letters unnaturally uniform. Someone had spent considerable time studying his signature, practicing until they could replicate it with criminal accuracy. The realization that his own son had orchestrated this deception sent waves of nausea through Harold's aging body. He had to grip the edge of the kitchen table to steady himself as the full implications crashed over him like a tsunami of betrayal. This wasn't just about money. This was about respect, about the fundamental bond between parent and child, about the sacred trust that Harold had believed would endure until his dying breath. Margaret's photograph smiled at him from the mantelpiece, her kind eyes seeming to offer comfort across the veil of death. She had always been the disciplinarian in their household, the one who insisted on consequences for bad behavior, while Harold had been content to shower their son with unconditional love. Perhaps she had seen something in Damien's character that Harold's rose-colored glasses had obscured. Perhaps her firm hand had been the only thing keeping their son's selfish tendencies in check. The elderly man rose from his chair, his joints protesting with the familiar symphony of age, and walked to the window overlooking his small backyard garden. Margaret's roses still bloomed there, tended by his inexpert but loving hands, their red petals bright against the morning sky. She had planted them during Damien's childhood, explaining to their young son that beautiful things required patience, care, and sacrifice to flourish. The lesson had apparently been lost somewhere along the way to adulthood. Harold thought about his neighbors, the Peterson family next door, who checked on him regularly and invited him for Sunday dinners. Their teenage son, Marcus, had helped him with yard work last summer, refusing payment but accepting Harold's homemade cookies with genuine appreciation. The contrast between Marcus's respectful gratitude and Damien's entitled demands was stark enough to bring tears to Harold's eyes. The weight of the decision ahead pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He could simply ignore the forged documents, pretend they had never arrived, and hope that the dealership would eventually realize the signature was fraudulent. But Harold knew his son well enough to understand that this was likely just the opening move in a larger game. Damien and Celestine had probably calculated that Harold would be too embarrassed, too heartbroken, or too afraid of family scandal to fight back effectively. They had underestimated him. 47 years in the steel mill had taught Harold the value of standing his ground when pushed too far. He had faced down aggressive supervisors, dangerous working conditions, and economic uncertainties with the same quiet determination that had carried him through Margaret's illness and death. His son might have forgotten the steel in his father's spine, but it was still there, tempered by decades of honest struggle and righteous principle. The phone rang, startling Harold from his contemplation. For a moment, his heart leaped with the irrational hope that it might be Damien calling to apologize, to explain that this had all been some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, Celestine's honey-sweet voice poured through the receiver like poisoned wine, her words crafted with the precision of a lawyer and the warmth of a snake oil salesman. "Harold, darling," she began, her tone suggesting an intimacy that had never existed between them. I hope you received our little gift in the mail. Damien and I are so excited about the new car, and we just knew you'd want to be part of making our dreams come true. After all, families should support each other, don't you think? The audacity of her approach left Harold momentarily speechless. She was speaking as if the forged signature was simply an oversight to be corrected, as if his consent had been assumed rather than stolen. The casual manipulation was breathtaking in its boldness, suggesting a level of entitlement that bordered on sociopathy. I never signed any such document, Harold finally managed, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest, like steam in a pressure cooker. And I never gave anyone permission to use my name as a guarantor for your purchases. Celestine's laugh tinkled through the phone like broken glass. Oh, Harold, don't be silly. Of course you did. It's right there in black and white. Your signature, your social security number, everything properly documented. The dealership has already processed the paperwork, and the car is sitting in our driveway as we speak. You wouldn't want to cause problems now, would you? Think about how embarrassing it would be for everyone involved. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Harold could read between the lines. Play along with their deception or face the humiliation of a public family scandal. They were betting that his pride and his love for his son would override his sense of justice, that he would swallow this bitter pill rather than admit to the world that his own child had betrayed him so completely. The signature is forged, Harold said quietly, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I may be old, Celestine, but I'm not senile. I know my own handwriting, and I know I never agreed to guarantee your debt. The silence that followed was pregnant with tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. When Celestine spoke again, her voice had shed its honeyed pretense, revealing the cold calculation beneath. That's a very serious accusation, Harold. Are you absolutely certain you want to go down this path? Because once you start making claims about forgery and fraud, there's no taking them back. Legal battles can be so expensive, so time-consuming. And at your age, do you really want to spend what time you have left fighting your own family? The implied threat sent a chill through Harold's bones, but it also crystallized his resolve. This woman, this stranger who had married his son and corrupted his heart, was essentially blackmailing him into accepting their theft. She was counting on his age, his isolation, and his love for Damien to make him compliant. She had miscalculated badly. I'm absolutely certain, Harold replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. And I'm also certain that I won't be paying a single penny toward your car loan. If you want to involve lawyers, Celestine, then we'll involve lawyers. But I won't be intimidated into financing your greed. The phone line went dead, leaving Harold staring at the receiver with a mixture of sadness and determination. He had just declared war on his own family, chosen principle over peace, justice over the easy path of submission. The decision felt both liberating and heartbreaking, like cutting away infected flesh to save the healthy tissue beneath. Harold spent the rest of that morning calling his attorney, a kind woman named Patricia Vance, who had helped him navigate the legal complexities surrounding Margaret's estate. Patricia listened to his story with professional attention, asking pointed questions about the timeline, the documentation, and the relationships involved. Her silence during his recounting was ominous, broken only by the occasional intake of breath that suggested she was hearing something worse than a simple family dispute. Harold, Patricia said finally, her voice grave with professional concern. What you're describing isn't just a civil matter. If your signature was forged on a legal document for the purpose of obtaining credit, that's criminal fraud. The authorities will need to be involved. The word criminal hit Harold like a physical blow. His son, his beloved wayward son, had crossed the line from selfish behavior into actual criminality. The boy he had raised, the child he had read bedtime stories to and taught to ride a bicycle, had become someone Harold barely recognized. The grief of that realization was almost unbearable, but it was coupled with a fierce determination to see justice done. Over the following days, Harold began to understand the true scope of his son's deception. Patricia's investigation revealed that this wasn't an isolated incident. Damien and Celestine had been systematically exploiting elderly relatives and acquaintances for months, using forged signatures and false promises to finance their increasingly expensive lifestyle. Harold's name had appeared on several other documents, guaranteeing everything from credit card debt to a second mortgage on a vacation property he had never seen. The paper trail painted a picture of calculated exploitation that made Harold's stomach turn. His son had become a predator, using his family connections and his wife's manipulative charm to target vulnerable seniors who trusted them. The elderly couple who lived 3 blocks away and had mentioned their loneliness to Damien during a chance encounter at the grocery store had found themselves guaranteeing a boat loan they knew nothing about. Margaret's sister Ruth, battling dementia in a nursing home, had apparently signed documents during one of their compassionate visits. Each revelation was like a fresh wound to Harold's heart, but it also strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting other innocent people from his son's predatory schemes. The weight of parental responsibility had shifted from nurturing to stopping, from enabling to exposing. The complexity of the case grew with each passing day. Patricia worked with law enforcement to unravel the web of forged documents and fraudulent transactions, while Harold found himself reliving painful memories as investigators asked detailed questions about his relationship with his son. The process was emotionally exhausting, but Harold pressed forward with the grim determination of a man who had finally found his moral compass, pointing true north. News of the investigation began to spread through their small community, carried on the whispered conversations of neighbors and the concerned inquiries of friends. Harold found himself at the center of a scandal he had never sought, defending decisions he had never imagined having to make. Some people expressed support for his courage in standing up to family members who would exploit him. Others questioned whether blood wasn't thicker than water, whether family loyalty shouldn't trump legal technicalities. The judgment of others weighed heavily on Harold's conscience, but not as heavily as the knowledge that his inaction would enable further crimes. He thought often of Margaret during those difficult weeks, imagining what she would say about the choice he had made. Her voice seemed to whisper encouragement in his ear during the darkest moments, reminding him that true love sometimes required tough choices. As the legal machinery slowly ground forward, Harold began to notice changes in his daily life that went beyond the stress of the investigation. His phone calls with distant relatives became stilted and uncomfortable, filled with awkward silences and careful topics of conversation. Family gatherings that he had never been invited to anyway became explicitly off-limits, with cousins and in-laws choosing sides in a conflict they only partially understood. The isolation was profound, but it was also clarifying. Harold began to see which relationships in his life were based on genuine affection and which were merely social obligations. His neighbor Marcus continued to help with yard work, now refusing payment more firmly than ever, as if trying to demonstrate that not all young people were motivated by greed. The Peterson family invited him for dinner more frequently, their kindness a warm contrast to his biological family's coldness. Patricia kept Harold informed of the legal proceedings with regular phone calls that became the highlight of his weeks. The case was complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and numerous victims, but the evidence was mounting steadily. Handwriting experts confirmed what Harold had known instinctively. The signatures were skilled forgeries, created by someone with access to legitimate samples and considerable practice in replication. Financial investigators traced the flow of money from the fraudulent loans, revealing a lifestyle of shocking extravagance funded entirely by other people's credit and trust. Damien and Celestine had purchased not just the luxury sedan that had triggered Harold's suspicions, but also expensive jewelry, designer clothing, and electronic equipment that filled their apartment with the trappings of wealth they had never earned. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation was deeply troubling. Damien appeared to have developed a sense of entitlement so profound that he genuinely believed other people existed primarily to fund his desires. His marriage to Celestine had accelerated this tendency, with her apparent expertise in manipulation providing the tools to act on impulses that might otherwise have remained unexpressed fantasies. Harold struggled to reconcile this portrait of his son with the memories he cherished from Damien's childhood. The little boy who had cried when he accidentally stepped on a butterfly had grown into a man who could callously exploit elderly relatives without apparent remorse. The transformation was so complete that Harold sometimes wondered if the child he remembered had ever really existed, or if he had simply projected his hopes onto a fundamentally damaged personality. The waiting became the hardest part. Legal proceedings moved with glacial slowness, each step requiring careful documentation and procedural compliance that stretched weeks into months. Harold found himself caught in a strange limbo, neither fully estranged from his son nor reconciled with him, living in the shadow of accusations that had not yet been formally adjudicated. During this period, Harold received several phone calls from Damien, each one more desperate than the last. The confident entitlement of their earlier conversations gave way to pleading, then to anger, then to threats that revealed the depth of his son's moral corruption. Damien claimed that Harold was destroying their family over money that didn't matter, that he was choosing strangers over his own blood, that Margaret would be ashamed of his vindictive behavior. Those last accusations cut deepest, because Harold had wondered the same thing during his loneliest moments. Would Margaret have found a way to handle this situation that preserved family unity while still maintaining moral principles? Would she have been able to reach the good person that surely still existed somewhere inside their son's corrupted heart? But as the evidence mounted and the scope of Damien's crimes became clear, Harold's doubts faded. Margaret had been a woman of fierce integrity, someone who had never compromised her values for the sake of keeping peace. She had raised their son with clear expectations about right and wrong, and she would have been heartbroken but unsurprised by Harold's decision to choose justice over family harmony. The phone calls from Damien eventually stopped, replaced by communications through lawyers that felt even more impersonal and hostile. Harold learned through these formal channels that his son and daughter-in-law were preparing their own legal strategy, apparently planning to argue that Harold had indeed signed the documents, but was now suffering from memory problems that made him believe otherwise. The cruelty of this approach, using his age and grief as weapons against him, revealed depths of callousness that Harold had not imagined possible. They were essentially arguing that he was incompetent, that his protests against their fraud were evidence of mental deterioration rather than moral clarity. The strategy was both personally devastating and legally dangerous, since a finding of incompetence could strip Harold of his independence and place his affairs under court supervision. Patricia worked diligently to counter this narrative, arranging for Harold to undergo comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations that would demonstrate his mental acuity. The process was humiliating but necessary, requiring Harold to submit to tests and interviews that felt designed to find flaws in his cognitive abilities. The results, thankfully, showed a man who was sharp, articulate, and fully capable of managing his own affairs. As winter gave way to spring, the case finally began to move toward resolution. The prosecutor's office had assembled a comprehensive case against Damien and Celestine, with Harold's situation serving as the centerpiece of a broader pattern of fraud that had victimized more than a dozen elderly people. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable, and the financial damage substantial enough to warrant serious criminal charges. Harold felt no joy in this development, only a profound sadness that it had come to this point. He had hoped until the very end that Damien would come to his senses, apologize for his behavior, and work to make amends for the damage he had caused. Instead, his son had doubled down on his deception, hiring expensive lawyers and crafting elaborate justifications for behavior that was fundamentally inexcusable. The media attention that accompanied the formal charges brought a new level of stress to Harold's life. Local news stations picked up the story of the elderly father who had turned in his own son for fraud, presenting it as either a heartwarming tale of principled courage or a tragic example of family dysfunction, depending on their editorial perspective. Harold found himself thrust into a spotlight he had never sought, his private pain transformed into public entertainment. Reporters called his house at all hours, seeking quotes and insights that Harold was reluctant to provide. He had no desire to publicly condemn his son, even after everything that had happened, but he also couldn't bring himself to minimize the seriousness of Damien's crimes. The middle ground he tried to maintain, expressing love for his son while supporting the legal process, satisfied no one and left him feeling exposed and vulnerable. The trial date was set for late summer, giving both sides time to prepare their arguments and assemble their witnesses. Harold dreaded the prospect of testifying against his own child, of sitting in a courtroom and recounting the details of his son's betrayal for a jury of strangers to judge. The legal system demanded his participation, but his heart rebelled against the unnaturalness of a father prosecuting his offspring. As spring bloomed into summer, Harold tried to maintain some semblance of normal life, while the legal machinery ground forward around him. He tended Margaret's garden with extra care, finding solace in the simple rhythms of watering and weeding that connected him to happier times. The roses grew particularly well that year, their blooms larger and more fragrant than he remembered, as if Margaret's spirit was somehow nurturing them from beyond the grave. The Peterson family continued to be a source of comfort and support, with young Marcus now bringing his girlfriend around to meet Harold and help with heavier garden work. The young woman, Sarah, reminded Harold painfully of what he had hoped Celestine might be. Kind, genuine, and clearly devoted to her boyfriend, for reasons that had nothing to do with material gain. Their easy affection and mutual respect highlighted the toxic nature of Damien and Celestine's relationship by contrast. Harold found himself becoming something of a cautionary tale in his community, with other elderly residents seeking his advice about protecting themselves from financial exploitation. The conversations were difficult, but necessary, as Harold shared hard-won wisdom about the warning signs of manipulation and the importance of trusting instincts when something felt wrong. His experience had transformed him from a victim into an inadvertent advocate, though the role sat uncomfortably on his shoulders. The preliminary hearings began in midsummer, with Harold required to testify about the circumstances surrounding the forged documents. Sitting in the witness box, looking across the courtroom at his son's hostile stare, Harold felt the full weight of their broken relationship settle on his chest like a physical burden. Damien looked older, harder, his face marked by stress and anger in ways that made him almost unrecognizable as the child Harold had raised. Celestine sat beside her husband, her appearance carefully crafted to project innocence and vulnerability. She had transformed herself from the calculating manipulator Harold knew her to be into a portrait of wronged femininity, complete with tears that seemed to flow on command. The performance was masterful but hollow, lacking the genuine emotion that would have made it believable to anyone who knew her true nature. Harold's testimony was straightforward and devastating. He recounted the timeline of events with careful precision, from the initial phone call demanding his financial support to the discovery of the forged documents to his decision to involve law enforcement. His voice remained steady throughout, though his hands trembled slightly as he identified exhibits and answered questions about his relationship with his son. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal, designed to portray Harold as a confused elderly man whose memory could not be trusted. The lawyer suggested that Harold had indeed signed the documents, but had forgotten due to the stress of his wife's death and his advancing age. The questions were pointed and personal, probing into Harold's grief, his loneliness, and his possible resentment toward his son's marriage. Harold weathered the attack with dignity, refusing to be rattled by implications that his mind was failing or his motives were suspect. He had prepared for this moment with Patricia's help, understanding that his credibility would be central to the prosecution's case. His clear, consistent answers and obvious mental acuity gradually undermined the defense's strategy, making their portrayal of him as incompetent seem increasingly desperate and unconvincing. The forensic evidence presented during the subsequent days of testimony was overwhelming. Handwriting experts demonstrated the subtle but definitive differences between Harold's genuine signature and the forged versions. Financial investigators traced the flow of money from the fraudulent loans, showing how Damien and Celestine had used the proceeds for luxury purchases rather than necessities. Computer forensics revealed searches for information about identity theft and signature forgery on devices registered to the defendants. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony from other victims. Elderly people who had trusted Damien and Celestine only to find themselves financially devastated by forged documents and empty promises. Their stories painted a picture of systematic exploitation that made Harold's case seem like just one example of a much larger pattern of criminal behavior. As the prosecution's case unfolded, Harold watched his son's facade of confidence gradually crumble. Damien's expensive suit and carefully styled hair could not disguise the growing desperation in his eyes, as witness after witness testified to his deceptive practices. The young man who had once demanded his father's financial support now sat silent and diminished, his sense of entitlement replaced by the dawning realization that consequences were finally arriving. Celestine's transformation was even more dramatic. The tears and vulnerability she had projected during the early stages of the trial gave way to cold calculation as her legal situation became increasingly precarious. Harold could see her evaluating her options, considering whether to maintain loyalty to her husband or seek a plea bargain that might save her from the harshest consequences of their joint crimes. The trial's second week brought character witnesses for both sides, creating a strange tableau of competing narratives about Damien's essential nature. His former employers testified to his charm and apparent reliability, while neighbors described his helpful demeanor and polite conversation. The portrait they painted was of a young man who seemed incapable of the systematic deception he was accused of perpetrating. Harold listened to these testimonials with mixed emotions, recognizing glimpses of the son he had raised, but also understanding how those very qualities had been weaponized for criminal purposes. Damien's charm had been used to gain victims' trust. His apparent reliability had made his promises seem credible, and his polite demeanor had prevented suspicion until it was too late to prevent financial damage. The defense's case, when it finally began, was built on a foundation of doubt and alternative explanations. Damien's lawyers argued that he had been manipulated by his wife, that his actions were the result of poor judgment rather than criminal intent, and that the evidence against him was circumstantial and incomplete. They painted him as a victim of circumstances and bad influences, a fundamentally good person who had made terrible mistakes. Celestine's defense took a different approach. portraying her as an innocent who had trusted her husband's assurances that all their financial arrangements were legitimate. She claimed to have signed documents without reading them carefully, believing that Damien was managing their affairs responsibly. Her testimony was polished and emotional, calculated to evoke sympathy from jurors who might see her as another victim rather than a co-conspirator. Harold found both defense strategies deeply troubling, not because they were legally invalid, but because they represented a continuation of the same pattern of deflection and denial that had characterized his son's behavior throughout the investigation. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing, Damien could not bring himself to accept responsibility for his actions or express genuine remorse for the harm he had caused. The closing arguments brought the trial's central themes into sharp focus. The prosecution portrayed Damien and Celestine as calculated predators who had systematically exploited the trust and vulnerability of elderly victims for personal gain. They emphasized the sophisticated nature of the fraud, the multiple victims involved, and the devastating impact on families who had believed they could trust their own relatives. The defense countered with appeals to sympathy and uncertainty, asking jurors to consider the possibility that misunderstandings and poor communication had been mistaken for criminal intent. They argued that the evidence, while suggestive, did not prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and that destroying two young lives over what might have been well-intentioned mistakes would serve no useful purpose. Harold sat through these competing narratives with a heavy heart, knowing that regardless of the jury's verdict, his relationship with his son was irreparably damaged. The trust that had taken decades to build had been shattered in a matter of months, leaving behind only the bitter residue of betrayal and disappointment. Even if Damien were somehow acquitted, Harold could never again feel secure in his presence or confident in his motives. The jury deliberations lasted 3 days, during which Harold remained in a state of suspended animation, unable to concentrate on normal activities but unwilling to leave town in case he was needed for additional proceedings. He spent long hours in Margaret's garden, finding comfort in the familiar routines of tending plants that responded predictably to care and attention. Unlike the human relationships that had proven so fragile and unreliable. Patricia called him on the 3rd day with news that the jury had reached a verdict. Harold's hands shook as he dressed for court, knowing that this moment would mark either vindication of his difficult decision or a devastating blow to his credibility and peace of mind. The walk from the courthouse parking lot to the courtroom felt like the longest journey of his life. Each step weighted with the accumulated stress and sorrow of the preceding months. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including reporters who had followed the trial's progress and community members who had been drawn by the unusual nature of a family conflict played out in such a public forum. Harold took his seat behind the prosecution's table, avoiding eye contact with his son but acutely aware of Damien's presence across the aisle. When the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Harold held his breath as the man's voice cut through the tension with words that would determine not just his son's fate, but the trajectory of their family's future. The verdict, when it came, was comprehensive and unambiguous. Guilty on all counts. With the jury apparently convinced that the evidence of systematic fraud was overwhelming and undeniable. Harold felt no triumph in that moment, only a profound sadness that it had come to this. His son's face crumpled as the verdict was read, the last vestiges of his defiant confidence finally giving way to the reality of his situation. Celestine's reaction was more controlled but equally devastating, her careful composure finally cracking to reveal the fear and desperation beneath. The sentencing phase of the proceedings would come later, allowing time for pre-sentence investigations and victim impact statements. Harold knew he would be asked to participate in that process, to quantify the emotional and financial damage his son's actions had caused. The prospect of standing before a judge and detailing his pain for the official record felt almost unbearable. But he understood it was a necessary part of seeking justice for all the victims. As the courtroom emptied and Harold prepared to leave, Damien's eyes met his across the distance that now separated them. For just a moment, Harold thought he saw a flicker of the boy he had raised, a glimpse of remorse and recognition that perhaps, finally, his son understood the magnitude of what he had done. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the blank stare of someone who had retreated deep within himself to escape the consequences of his actions. The drive home from the courthouse was surreal, marked by a strange mixture of relief and grief that left Harold feeling emotionally exhausted. He had achieved what he set out to accomplish, justice for himself and the other victims. But the victory felt hollow and pyrrhic. He had saved his integrity at the cost of his family, chosen principle over the comfortable lie that might have preserved some semblance of relationship with his son. Patricia called that evening to congratulate him on the verdict and discuss the next steps in the legal process. Her professional satisfaction was evident, but she also seemed to understand the emotional complexity of Harold's situation. She had seen enough family disputes resolved through litigation to know that legal victory rarely translated into personal healing, that some wounds were too deep to be addressed by courtroom proceedings. The local news coverage of the verdict was extensive, with Harold's story presented as both a cautionary tale about financial exploitation and an inspiring example of moral courage. The reporters who had pursued him throughout the trial process now sought his reaction to the jury's decision. But Harold found himself with little to say that could adequately capture the complexity of his emotions. He was proud of standing up for what was right, grateful that justice had been served, and relieved that the ordeal was finally approaching its conclusion. But he was also heartbroken by the loss of his son, devastated by the revelation of depths of selfishness he had never imagined possible, and uncertain about how to rebuild a life that had been fundamentally altered by the events of the past year. The sentencing hearing, held several weeks later, brought the legal proceedings to their formal conclusion. Harold delivered his victim impact statement with quiet dignity, describing not just the financial damage, but the emotional devastation of being betrayed by someone he had loved and trusted unconditionally. His words were measured and sorrowful rather than angry, reflecting his genuine grief over the loss of the relationship he had cherished. Damien received a substantial prison sentence, with the judge noting the systematic nature of his crimes and the particular cruelty of exploiting elderly victims who had trusted him. Celestine received a lighter sentence in exchange for her cooperation with authorities, though her marriage to Damien appeared to be another casualty of their criminal enterprise. The couple, who had seemed so united in their entitlement and greed, were now facing separate futures shaped by the consequences of their joint actions. As Harold left the courthouse for the final time, he felt the weight of a chapter closing in his life. The legal battle was over, justice had been served, and he could finally begin the process of moving forward. But the scars left by his son's betrayal would take much longer to heal, and the fundamental questions about love, family, and moral responsibility that the experience had raised would likely persist for the rest of his days. The months that followed brought a gradual return to something resembling normal life, though Harold's definition of normal had been permanently altered by his experiences. He continued to tend Margaret's garden, finding solace in the cycles of growth and renewal that connected him to happier times. The Peterson family remained a constant source of support, with their kindness serving as a reminder that not all relationships were transactional or conditional. Harold began receiving letters from some of the other victims of his son's fraud, people who wanted to thank him for his courage in coming forward and making their own recovery possible. These communications were both gratifying and painful, representing connections forged through shared trauma, but also reminders of the extensive damage Damien had caused to innocent people who had trusted him. The garden grew particularly beautiful that year, with Margaret's roses blooming in abundance and new plantings thriving under Harold's increasingly experienced care. He found himself spending more time outdoors, drawn by the simple pleasure of nurturing living things that responded positively to attention and care. The contrast with his family relationships was stark but not entirely discouraging. It reminded him that growth and beauty were still possible, even after periods of damage and neglect. Harold never received any communication from Damien during his incarceration, and he made no effort to initiate contact. The silence was painful but also protective, allowing both men time to process what had happened without the complication of ongoing interaction. Harold hoped that prison might provide his son with the opportunity for reflection and perhaps even genuine remorse. But he was no longer willing to sacrifice his own well-being to facilitate Damien's redemption. The experience had taught Harold important lessons about the limits of parental responsibility and the necessity of maintaining personal boundaries, even with family members. He had spent decades prioritizing his son's happiness over his own principles, enabling patterns of behavior that had ultimately led to criminal conduct. While he would always love the child Damien had been, he could no longer ignore the man Damien had become. As winter approached again, Harold found himself reflecting on the year that had changed everything. The pain of his son's betrayal remained fresh, but it was no longer the dominant emotion in his daily life. He had discovered reserves of strength he hadn't known he possessed, formed new relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, and learned to find peace in simple pleasures rather than complex family dynamics. The legal victory had been important, but the personal growth that followed was perhaps more significant. Harold had reclaimed his dignity, protected other vulnerable people from exploitation, and demonstrated that moral courage was possible even in the most difficult circumstances. These achievements could not restore his relationship with his son, but they provided a foundation for building a meaningful life in whatever years remained to him. Margaret's photograph still smiled at him from the mantelpiece, and Harold often found himself having imaginary conversations with her about the choices he had made. He believed she would be proud of his decision to choose justice over family harmony, principle over the easy path of enabling continued bad behavior. Her memory had become a source of strength rather than just sorrow, a reminder of the values they had shared and the legacy they had tried to create together. The approaching anniversary of the trial's conclusion brought media requests for follow-up interviews, but Harold declined most of them. He had no interest in reliving the painful details of his son's crimes or positioning himself as a symbol of anything larger than personal integrity. His story had been told, justice had been served, and now he preferred to focus on the quiet business of living well rather than the public drama of family dysfunction. Harold's neighbors and friends had largely rallied around him throughout the ordeal, but some relationships had been strained by the complexity of the situation. A few people continued to believe that family loyalty should have trumped legal considerations, that Harold should have found a way to handle the matter privately rather than involving law enforcement. These criticisms stung, but Harold had made peace with the reality that not everyone would understand or approve of his choices. The garden beckoned, as always, offering the promise of spring renewal and the simple satisfaction of work that produced tangible, beautiful results. Harold planned new plantings and contemplated improvements that would honor Margaret's memory while reflecting his own evolving relationship with the space she had created. The roses would bloom again, as they had every year since her death, carrying forward the beauty she had planted even as the world around them continued to change. Looking back on the painful journey from discovery to trial to aftermath, Harold could trace the path that had led him from victimhood to empowerment, from family dysfunction to personal integrity. The cost had been enormous. The loss of his relationship with his son, the public scrutiny, the emotional trauma of confronting systematic deception by someone he loved. But the alternative, enabling continued criminal behavior through silence and complicity, would have been far worse. Harold had chosen the harder path, the one that required him to prioritize abstract principles over concrete relationships, future victims over present family harmony. The decision had exacted a terrible price, but it had also preserved his moral integrity and protected other vulnerable people from exploitation. In the end, those considerations had proven more important than maintaining the illusion of family unity built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. As Harold settled into his chair by the window, watching the last leaves of autumn drift down onto Margaret's garden, he felt a complex mixture of sadness and satisfaction. The man he had been a year ago, trusting, naive, desperate to maintain family connections at any cost, was gone, replaced by someone harder but also more honest, more aware of his own worth and the importance of defending it. The phone rang occasionally with calls from reporters or lawyers or social workers, but Harold had learned to be selective about which conversations deserved his time and energy. He was no longer the vulnerable elderly man who could be manipulated through appeals to family loyalty or threats of social embarrassment. The trial had burned away his illusions, but also his fear, leaving behind someone who knew his own mind and trusted his own judgment. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer terrifying. Harold had proven to himself that he could survive the worst kind of family betrayal and emerge with his principles intact. Whatever challenges remained, aging, loneliness, health concerns, financial limitations, seemed manageable in comparison to what he had already endured and overcome. Margaret's roses would bloom again in the spring, as they always did, carrying forward the beauty and love she had planted in soil that had been nourished by tears, struggle, and ultimately, triumph. Harold would tend them as he always had, finding in their annual renewal a reminder that growth was possible even after the harshest winters, that beauty could emerge from the most damaged ground. The story was ending where it had begun, in Harold's kitchen, with documents spread across the table. But these were different papers now. Thank you letters from fellow victims, legal notifications of restitution payments, newspaper clippings documenting a victory that had cost everything and meant everything. The elderly man who studied them bore little resemblance to the confused and heartbroken father who had first discovered his son's betrayal, though the same fundamental decency animated both versions of himself. Harold folded the papers carefully and placed them in the drawer where he kept Margaret's letters and the photos of happier times. Some stories ended with reconciliation and forgiveness, but this one ended with justice and self-respect. It wasn't the ending he would have chosen, but it was the ending that honored the values he had tried to live by and the legacy he hoped to leave behind. The garden waited outside, dormant but not dead, holding within its frozen soil the promise of spring and renewal. Harold would be there to see it bloom again, older and sadder, but also wiser and stronger, carrying forward the love that had created the beauty while leaving behind the illusions that had enabled its near destruction. Some endings were really beginnings, and some losses were actually discoveries of what had been there all along, waiting to be claimed by someone brave enough to pay the price of truth.